K-State. He helped with things like the Pathways Retreat. And since then, he has been teaching. He was a religion teacher at St. Xavier's in Junction City, and now he is a history teacher at Wamego. So I'd like to welcome Ross, and I will turn it over to him.
Can you all hear me all right with this? Okay, cool. They made a mistake in giving me a microphone. In my hallway at school, the other teachers down the hall have to shut their doors because my voice kind of carries. So if it gets too loud, I'll just turn this off if I don't need it. So thank you all for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here. This is my first time teaching RCIA. This is my first time teaching, in a while at least, a group of adults. I spend most of my days talking to 14-year-olds, so I'm very excited to talk to some adults, have some higher level conversations. So throughout tonight, you've got a couple of things that you picked up on the way in. Can I see your thingies right here? Yeah. Thank you. So what you picked up, hopefully, was this for discipleship group session 4, Story of Salvation. If you didn't, they're over by the door. Father Mike will be over there. This is kind of like the participant guide that you've got in your binders. When I was putting this all together, I didn't realize there were 2 versions of this. I used this version, so we're giving you this version of the participant guide as well. It's kind of the same stuff, it's just a different format a little bit. And then this is my notes. You'll notice this is the same stuff that's up here. This is just kind of what we're going to be working through at the beginning of the evening. I'm kind of going off script with some of the stuff that's in our guide here. So we're not going to be following that exactly, but we will be using it for discussion questions and things like that. So when we do discussion questions, and let me tell you which ones we are going to do. We are going to do, you can go ahead and go through it and mark these. So we're going to go, there's a saying, God writes straight with crooked lines. We are going to do Genesis 3:15, called the Proto-Evangelium. And how would you respond to someone who says, I have difficulty? So we're going to do those, and then one other one kind of there in between. Awesome. So when we do discussion questions, you're going to discuss it in your groups, and then it would be really awesome if you have one person, maybe it could be a different person every question, kind of shout out one of the answers. Once we're done, kind of shout out some of the answers that your group kind of came up with so that we actually have something to discuss then as a group. We're here for some fellowship, so that's a great way to get out of our little tables and kind of get in as a group. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we have kind of the story of humanity is kind of where we start. And as we go, feel free to fill these in with the stuff that we're talking about, or don't. That's, whatever. I'm not your mother. It's fine. You can do whatever you want. So the story of salvation, we kind of break it down into 3 parts. We have the image and likeness. Which as you can see, we're going to kind of break down here with the mirror. We have the separation through sin, or just separation even. And then the reunification. And so that kind of serves as a framework for everything that we're going to do tonight. I've kind of done it in different colors. And you can see they're broken down there by the different arrows. It's kind of our topic heading. So first let's start with the idea of creation. That's what tonight is. It's about creation. It's about the fall, what we call the fall, and then also about the beginning of salvation history, which is kind of really what the Bible's all about. You have one little star there next to that first piece here, the story of humanity. And it's that Scripture always has one purpose kind of above all else. And sometimes there are a lot of, like, what the crowd says are hard sayings. This is a hard teaching. And sometimes these things don't make sense necessarily in our modern context, or it's kind of hard to grasp what's being said in the Scriptures. And so whenever I encounter those, and I encourage you whenever you encounter those, which we will kind of grapple with some of them tonight, is when you look at these texts that are hard, that are difficult to understand, you got to think of Scripture's underlying purpose. It is always, it is many things, but it is always among them to reveal who God is to us, right? There is always something being revealed to us about who God is in every verse, in every word of every verse in Scriptures. They reveal something about who God is. It's important to understand that it's not necessarily all a history textbook. It's not necessarily all a letter. It's all of those things, and at the same time, sometimes it seems like it's none of those things. So that's kind of what we're going to be dealing with here as we go through creation. So we kind of deal with this whole creation question. This first one is, why even bother creating us? It seems like all the time we're just really messed up. We do a lot of bad things. We messed up from the very beginning. If you're familiar at all with the creation story, it pretty much goes well for about 3.5 seconds, and then we screw it all up. So, why even create us to begin with? If God is all-knowing, then, He knows that this is going to happen, so why are we here? And it really comes down to something that is said in the New Testament. It's 3 little words that really kind of explain what the reason for creation is, and it is God is love. So I'm going to throw that down here. And it's this idea that love is not experienced in a vacuum. Love is only experienced in a communion of persons. And God Himself is a communion of persons. He is the Trinity, His Father, Son, and Spirit. And just like that, He basically wants to share in creation with us, right? By creating us in His likeness and image, then He is able to then share that with us. It's one of the aspects of creation that we share with God, and is our ability to love, our ability to experience love, as we will talk about here in a little bit. Something that's really difficult for a lot of people to grapple with is the idea of the 6 days of creation and then the 7th day of rest. There are a lot of people who just simply, out of what they feel like is necessity, kind of throw that away, go, we're just going to deal with that, and so we struggle with this literal versus allegorical, and we struggle with literal versus historical. And it's an important distinction to make that, being literal something not being literal does not mean it is also not historical. So in the Catholic Church, one of the kind of non-negotiables in the Catechism is that we believe that Adam and Eve existed, that they were historical people. So something can be historical without necessarily being literal, or it can be laced with figurative language. If you're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and your cousin reaches across the table and is taking sixths, from the pumpkin pie and the stuffing and the turkey, you might say, you are just an absolute pig. You don't actually mean that they have turned into a swine at the table. It's figurative language, but it is also true, right? They have become a pig. They have become kind of something gross. And so, and not that everything here that we're dealing with, especially in Genesis, is either one or the other. But it's important not to just crumple this thing up because again, this is a hard saying, or this is a hard teaching. We do believe that Adam and Eve were historical people. We do believe that that creation was guided by the Lord. But if you look at the early church fathers, so in the early church, right, the first several centuries of the church, we look to these writers called the church fathers. You'll see that actually they did not, and neither did the Jews that came before them, the Hebrews. They did not understand it to be 6, 24 solar periods. They did not understand it to be 6 literal days of creation. It is explained in days as God creates in phases. And so then we kind of get to this question of nature's nature, and it really comes down to, if you're going to create something, why aren't you going to let it work, right? Nature has a way of working. We can see that in the seasons. We see that in the way that a river changes course over time. And so if you're going to create a system that works, why won't you let it work? And that's kind of this idea of creation, is that God can be present through His creation, and He can be very present in the moments of creation. That doesn't mean that He doesn't also have a process that He's working through. If you build a clock, you're going to let it tell the time. You would not create a clock and then pull the hands off of it. That just doesn't make sense. It's not ordered towards its creation. It is ordered to tell you the time. Otherwise, it's just a circle on the wall that ticks every now and then. So we have the days of creation that we kind of deal with in this idea of the phases. And if you look at it, it's kind of neat because you can see the nature, kind of springing forth, right? Carrying out nature's nature. It is acting according to what we see in the world today. God creates, it says first that, He creates the skies, He separates the water and then brings forth the land. And if you look at it, then He brings forth the creatures in these environments, right? They don't come without their environments. You don't get fish and all these things, flopping around in the air. The oceans are there first, right? And so if you think about it in terms of, modern what are considered a lot of times, modern historical analysis of paleontological data, that's kind of what we see. You can't have trilobites crawling around, an empty ocean. And so, we do get that from Scripture. And so it's not necessarily meant to be viewed as a history. But what's awesome about the Catholic faith is that it doesn't often make negative statements, or issue negative proclamations. You cannot do this, or you cannot believe this. What it does is it actually gives us the liberty to hold to, in some sense, our own interpretation. It's not our own interpretation, but those words speak to you in a way. And again, we go back to, what is God revealing about Himself here? Is it really important, how the earth was created, or is it more important that the earth was created and that we were created to be in it, and that we were created to be here? It is not good that we should be alone. That man should be alone, and so then we have male and female. That's really the important piece here in creation. We can get wrapped up in arguments all day, between ourselves and between our family members and members outside. But we don't necessarily need to do that. So we can see through the days of creation, we can see nature's nature, that God is creating through a process. And so then we move on to this idea of created in the image and likeness. When we say image and likeness, I like to use the analogy of a mirror. So your mirror can give you an image, but it does not give you the thing. And so I think I've written there in the margins that a mirror does not reproduce what is being reflected. It is not, when I look in the mirror, that's not me. I'm right here, right? That's not me, but it is a reflection of me. It shows the attributes of me. It kind of demonstrates some aspects of who I am. And in that way, that is how we are created in the image and likeness of God. That does not necessarily mean that God the Father is walking around with an eyes, nose, and a mouth and everything that looks like us. That's the Son. The Son is the one with the body that looks like us. So I mentioned earlier that God is a communion of persons, and this is, I think, one of the more profound aspects of our creation, is that we are also a communion of persons. And it takes a moment to kind of step back and realize this, but that is why we are created, male and female. So we can kind of fill this thing out here. So we have Father and and Son, rather. And it is kind of the communion of these two, the self-giving of each one to the other, and the full acceptance of the other that creates this third person and allows the opportunity for this third person to enter into our lives. When we get later on, when you get to Jesus' death on the cross, we have these crucifixes everywhere. When you get later on into the death of Jesus on the cross, you kind of get into this saga where it's not just Jesus dying. It is Jesus dying and offering Himself. He says He could stop this at any moment. He could order legions of angels to stop this at any moment. He's giving of Himself. And it is in that gift, and the Father accepts on behalf of all of us. Right? His death was not to atone for His own sins. His death was not to atone for a certain group of people's sins. Certainly, as many early Christians thought, maybe it's just the Jews' sins, and then it expands into the Gentile territory. But it is this total gift on behalf of someone else, right? This total emptying out and this total reception by the Father, and it is also the Son receiving what the Father is giving Him in His acceptance of this mission early on. This creates the opening for the Holy Spirit. Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit, doesn't happen until after the cross. It doesn't happen until after this total gift of self. And so then, what I think is the really cool part of this, dropping my markers everywhere, is that when we look at humans, we look at how He creates them. He creates them as male and female. And the earliest elders who are telling these stories, right? These are oral traditions first. They're told, by word of mouth, around a crackling campfire. And the oldest of our society recognize something very profound in the way we are, created, the way we are ordered. Just like a clock is ordered in its creation to tell time, we are ordered in our bodies for the self-gift. And, then this is the cool part. So it is this total self-gift of the male and the female, of the husband and the wife, that brings forth also new life. Right? It is this total exchange of persons that becomes so real, becomes so profound, that it results in this new life. And so there are many, many aspects of God in our created persons. This is my favorite one. This is what I think is maybe one of the cooler ones that when you look at it, you just go, and kind of have one of those moments if you really get it. So, we move on to the fall. Humanity is created perfect, or rather, our relationship with God is perfect. We are created in union with Him. Again, He created us so that we could share in this love. And love is, not selfish, as the New Testament tells us. Love is kind, it is patient, it is all those things. And we seem to not be that a lot. If any of you are married, you can relate that sometimes our spouses or even ourselves are not those things all the time. And so, where did this whole thing go wrong? And so the Genesis account tells us, that basically it comes down to Adam and Eve question God. They don't place their full trust in Him. When He says, "Don't eat this. This will hurt you," they say, "Really? Will it?" And when they commune with the serpent, right, with the tempter, they kind of allow him in. And so it goes back to this image and likeness. We aren't created as God. We are created in the image of God. There are aspects of our creation that are present. And so when the serpent says, "No, eat this, you will be like gods," it's kind of going back to this piece here of this bit about being created in the image. And he says, no, you can do better than just the image, right? And that's really what sin is it's taking us and it's giving us, the phony relationship with whatever it is, with things, with people. We can use all those things instead of seeking the real good. And that's kind of what we do, is we substitute the real goods in our lives for the phonies. We substitute the buffet for what's in the dumpster and go, "Oh man, I got full," but in reality, I'm very sick now. I don't recommend eating out of dumpsters, by the way. So, I had this question of, the difference between infinity and anywhere else. With this perfect relationship that we're created in, the moment we sin, the moment that we choose to turn away from that, we've gone somewhere else, right? If God is infinitely perfect, infinity is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but if He is infinitely perfect, infinitely good, literally anywhere else on the map is infinitely far from Him. And so that relationship is severed. And so, we become, it's the difference between perfection and one flaw. It's no longer perfect. Even the smallest little thing is infinitely far from God, right? I can't reach across the cosmos. I can't reach across time and space to where God is. It requires Him now reaching down to me, right? Which is why we get all of this salvation history. We see God repeatedly reaching across, the distance, this infinite distance that separates us. Only an infinite being can cross an infinite space. And we see Him reaching across to us and trying to bring us back after we repeatedly, fail. He says, "Hey, don't do this thing," and then we go do that thing almost immediately. And so, this is honestly one of my favorite parts of the Old Testament. It's right there in the beginning. It's I think, maybe Genesis chapter 3. And so, God is walking around the garden after the sin, and He says these things. Adam and Eve are hiding, and He says, "Where are you?" Now, you can't tell me that an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing God doesn't know where they are, right? This is silly to think that He's going, "Really, where did you go?" He knows where they are, right? "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I told you not to eat from?" And then Eve comes along and He says, "What have you done?" He knows all these things. He knows your heart. He knows mine. He knew theirs. So when He's asking these things, it's not for His own benefit. He knows this is the first confession. Here you go. Here's the first sacrament of reconciliation. He's sitting across from his pastor, and he's being asked these questions in order to reveal, to draw out of him kind of what's lodged itself in there. These things that have now separated him from God, excuse me, these things that have separated he and Eve from God, God is now pulling out of him. And immediately he goes and tries to repair that damage that's done. He makes them clothing. And I think it's an interesting point that when he makes them clothing, it's made out of skins, leather, right? Now, you can't go get leather without killing something. You can't go up to a deer, say, hey, Bambi, can I borrow your skin for a minute? You've got to kill whatever it is you're pulling that leather from. And this goes back to this idea of sacrifice, that the distance between infinite and anywhere else, the consequence for breaking a law that is so perfect that an infinitely perfect being laid it down for you, the only consequence for that is death. The slightest breaking of that rule is death. And so something dies as a result of this sin, right? And it is an atonement for the sin. Well, fine, we'll fix the damage, right? We'll cover you up because now you know you're naked. And, we'll move on from here, and we establish a series of covenants, right? Come back to me. I'll make it better, but you have to come to me, right? And so then we start getting this series of, this kind of tradition of animal sacrifice, and ultimately we have the sacrifice of the Lamb of God on the cross, right? The final sacrifice that cannot be made more perfect because it is God Himself sacrificing Himself. So, pretty profound stuff. Covenants, I kind of mention it on its own because a covenant is not necessarily a biblical term. It is definitely a biblical term. The term testament means covenant, right? So you got the Old Testament, the New Testament. It means the Old Covenants and our New Covenant. Our New Covenant is about what? It's not rhetorical. You can answer. I heard it. The J word. Yeah, okay, good. So the New Covenant is established with Jesus, right? The Old Covenants are established with these patriarchs and the nation of Israel. Covenants were a way of political agreement. So kings and queens, emperors and warlords, they would make covenants with each other to basically sign a peace treaty. Instead of having this big long document in a time when most people couldn't read or write, they would have a ceremony with a covenant involved. And so we read about one of these first covenants here in, let's see, I've got it, Genesis, got it in my notes here, 3:15. Would somebody read that? Does anybody have one of these? A Bible? Okay. Well, let me pull it up. Sorry, I should have had this unprepared. What not to do. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. They will strike at your head, while you strike at their heel. This is a piece called the Proto-Evangelium. So it's this word here. It's a Latin word. It's kind of a conjunction, I guess you would call it. What does proto mean? What does proto mean? Or where have you heard the word proto before? Right, with prototype, right? It's something that comes before the final product. Evangelium is Latin for gospel. So this is the first gospel. This is the pre-gospel. So here's what I want you to do. In your groups, I'd like you to discuss, I think this is one of those questions there maybe. We blew right by one of our questions. We'll get back to it. So Genesis 3:15 is called the Proto-Evangelium, which is Latin for the first gospel. Why do you think this verse is called the first gospel? Does it list the verse out for you? Okay, good. So there's the verse in front of you. Go ahead and discuss that in your groups for a minute or two, and then we'll kind of reconvene and see what we find. So maybe something wasn't quite as clear. I see some people with Bibles out, and that's awesome. Real quick, before we reconvene here, let me read the verses immediately before this piece and immediately after to kind of make it clear who this is addressed to, if it wasn't clear already. So, then the Lord God said to the snake, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all the animals, tame or wild. On your belly you shall crawl, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. They will strike at your head, while you strike at their heel. To the woman he said, I will intensify your toil in childbearing in pain. You shall bring forth children, yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. To the man he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat from it." Okay, so what did we come up with? Yeah, it's setting it up for this kind of epic battle, right? Absolutely. Anybody else? That's great. Thank you. Yes?
We came up with the preview of why a Savior and salvation will be necessary.
Yeah, it's kind of... So can you go a little bit farther with that, why it's necessary?
Bring us back to God.
Right, yeah.
Bring us after we've fallen.
Right. What'd you guys come up with? There's a really good discussion here.
Yeah, so I talked about it foreshadowing the gospel, the fact that this is kind of the first inkling that what sin has put astray, what the snake has obviously there is going to be set right. It says that the offspring of the woman, shall bruise the snakes, or shall strike, shall crush the head. It's going to be Jesus.
Right. Yeah, this is an allusion to the Holy Family, right? This idea of the woman's offspring crushing the serpent's head, we get kind of the prefigurement, right, of Mary, the new Holy of Holies, and then her son, Jesus Christ, coming in and once and for all crushing, what has been done by Adam and Eve. Jesus and Mary are often called, in Catholic tradition, the new Adam and the new Eve, because if we look at them, both sets are, we look at them as created without flaw. We look at them as having a divine purpose. And then the difference between Adam and Eve and Jesus and Mary, obviously Jesus and Mary, not a married couple, right? But they're both man and woman, is that while Adam and Eve have disobedience, Jesus and Mary have perfect obedience, right? It starts with an act of obedience from Mary, and then it is followed through in Jesus' act of obedience, in the garden. He says 3 times in the garden, not my will, but yours be done, right? He reaffirms his obedience 3 times, and then he stretches his arms out for us, right? In this ultimate crushing of the serpent. Yeah, so it is Jesus that brings that forth. Absolutely. Well, that's awesome. Thank you. Anybody else have anything? Yes? What's that? Right, yeah, this is the first curse, right? These are what are called covenant curses. Whenever there's a covenant made, there are curses associated with it should you break that covenant. A deal doesn't matter unless it hurts, unless you break it. That's why you sign contracts, right, that have a nasty little exit clause on there, right? It hurts when you break a covenant or a contract, and here it also hurts when you break this contract, right? What did you read into some of what those consequences were? Anybody read into some of those? The biggest consequence is death, right? This is when death and sickness enter into the world. This is when death robs us of our kind of eternal communion with God, from the moment we are conceived. We were created to be in that communion with Him, and so that first consequence of that sin is spiritual death. right? And it takes God reaching across to us to pull us back. Ultimately, this is, setting us up for the Gospels, for the coming of the Savior, Jesus Christ. Okay, anybody else? That was great, thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. So, we have proto-evangelium, and then this leaves us with what's called concupiscence. And this isn't actually in your notes. I forgot to put it in there. I kind of left it out. If you want to put this term in there, this is kind of one of the big takeaways of tonight. This is one of those technical Catholic terms that we use. Concupiscence. And it really, all it means is the tendency towards sin. Once we rob ourselves, once our first parents, Adam and Eve, rob us of that vision of what it's like to live in perfect communion with God, we can no longer see just how wrong our sin is, right? If you could see the consequences of every little sin we've ever made, we would shudder, right? You would do your absolute best never to sin again, right? Never to stray from that path, because we just don't see the consequences of those things, right? They echo through time and space. We can look back in time and see how the sins of maybe our ancestors or other groups of people throughout history have echoed until today, right? Just as maybe our sin echoes down into our children. And that's kind of the purpose here, is that this separation from infinity, right? It echoes down to you and I, so that you and I are no longer born with that kind of ultimate communion anymore. That's original sin, right? So this is the concept of original sin. Let's move on to the new covenant. So we fast forward a couple chapters in Genesis, and we get to somebody named Abram. Abram has his name changed by God at one point, and when someone names something, so Adam names the animals. Abram and Sarai are renamed Abraham and Sarah. There are several renamings throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, the best example is Jesus, when he changes Simon's name to Peter, to rock, right, to Kepha in the Greek. And so, I think that's the Greek, right? Correct? Kephas? What? Yeah, is Kephas Aramaic? Yeah, because Petros is the Greek, right? Yeah, thank you. Excellent. So, when a name is changed, it means a new following, or it means a new ownership almost, where now, if I name you, I have authority over you, right? And so Abram, allowing his name to be changed to Abraham, God is now taking authority over this family, right? This group of people that Abraham has with him. And at one point here in Genesis 15, and this is also pretty cool. Let's go here. So Genesis, if you've got a Bible, awesome. Genesis 15, verse 5 is where I'm headed. There it is. Okay. So Abraham is childless. For some background, he's kind of wandering in the desert at this point. He's headed towards a new land. God has told him to leave his city of Ur, spelled U-R, Ur. He's told to leave that city with a very creative name and go to a new land that he's going to be given. He has no heirs, though. And so he's kind of communing with the Lord at this point. And Abram continued, "Look, you have given me no offspring, so a servant of my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "No, that one will not be your heir. Your own offspring will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. Just so," he added, will your descendants be." He says, go outside and look at the stars. These are all your descendants. And throughout the course of this new covenant, right, this new political alliance between God and man, this is the third or fourth one at this point, this new alliance, he says, you're going to have all these descendants. Count them if you can. But then fast forward to verse 12, where it goes down and he says, throughout the ages, it's different in this one, hang on. Oops. There we go, my page switched on me. So we go to, as the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and a great dark dread descended upon him. It wasn't night when he said, go out and look at the stars. It was daytime. And you can't see the stars during the daytime. He said, go out and count the stars if you can. And you can't see them. And this kind of prefigures this idea that, and he tells Abraham, You're not going to live to see it, but I promise you it's going to happen. And it kind of goes to this whole piece about us being human and us being so limited in our physical presence here on earth that sometimes we can't necessarily wrestle with all that God gives us. Or it seems like we can't. But He makes this promise to Abraham, and then He follows through with it. And it's there to remind us that He follows through on His promises to us as well. That if you follow my Son, listen to what He says, and I'll be there for you. Listen to what He says, and you'll be mine. All right? These promises are hard. As I said in the beginning, these sayings are hard, but they are not impossible. Those stars are still there. You just can't see them yet. Right? And then during that time period, right before he falls asleep, it says that he gathered all these animals together, and he cut them in half and kind of laid them in a row, which is why I have this dead bull on both your paper and up here, which is kind of a weird symbol. It's a weird thing to do. It seems like it's taken out of context. And throughout the course of this, Abraham actually, he was told, split these animals in two, set them out, and then I'll be with you. And he does this, and he's waiting around, and it takes all day, and nothing happens. And he's just waiting around. He's having to beat off the vultures and the animals, and he's having to kick the wolves away and all this. And none of that is happening. Nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden he falls into this sleep. And then we get this really weird sounding verse where it says, when the sun had set and it was dark, there appeared a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, which passed between those pieces of the animals. The way ancient covenants were established, again, before people could read and write, a lot of times widely, political covenants between nations would be brokered this way. You would take an animal, you would kill it, and then you'd split it in half, and you'd separate the halves just a little bit. And both rulers, I'm going to kind of demonstrate here, would kind of walk between the two halves, right? And then you walk out the other side, and what are you covered in now? Blood. It's a symbol of what happens if you break this covenant. There will be blood, right? Something had to die for our peace to survive. Don't let anything else die because you couldn't keep this covenant, right? So God is taking a very human expression that Abraham would have been familiar with, and He's making it divine. So he appears as this boiling pot, right, and a torch moving between these pieces. And it symbolizes kind of the things that His descendants, as numerous as the stars as they may be, are going to go through some hard things. They're going to go through this boiling furnace of a time. And as you read through the histories of ancient Israel and you look at the archaeological sources, they never had it easy. Right? They must have been God's people because everybody was after Him all the time. And the big sticking point was really that they only worshipped one God. Everybody else worshipped many. That causes problems when a king comes over and says, hey, worship me as a god. And you say, no, we're good, thanks. That's when he kicks over your temple. That's what happens to him. But then there's also this torch that's traveling with them, right? It's always present there. It doesn't go out, even though this boiling pot is also going through the covenant with them. So it's kind of this beautiful symbolism of what is to come. So it's not always just, well, this is a weird saying, I'm going to kind of throw it out. Sometimes we have to kind of look at, again, what does this reveal about God? What does He want us to get about Him as we read this? So instead of me yapping at you anymore, we're going to watch this.
Well, thank you so much, Ross. Thanks for being here. Did an excellent job of helping to unpack the story of salvation. Not an easy task to do in about 70 minutes or so. So he did an excellent job. We're happy to have him here. Just a couple of announcements here on our end. Next week, we will be exploring the question, who is Jesus Christ? So it will be an excellent session. The following week, just as a heads up, we will not be meeting. It is All Saints Day. It's a holy day of obligation. We'll talk more about what that means next class. But the key thing is, for right now, we will not be meeting. However, there is something, a little piece of homework that you'll need to be doing over the next few weeks. And it kind of relates to that. When on Easter, the Easter Vigil, for those of you who will be confirmed or entering the church, you will be asked to choose a confirmation name, and that'll be the name of a saint. And so we do that to, number one, choose a saint who we can kind of model our lives after someone who led a very holy life themselves. And then also to have somebody, a special saint, to be praying for us, to be praying on our behalf. So think about it, pray about it, talk to your sponsor about it especially, and start researching lives of saints. It can be relating to your given name. So like, I'm Maria, maybe I would want to choose Saint Maria Goretti, but it can also be so much more than that. Just researching the lives of the saints, maybe you'll find one who you really relate to because of some circumstance in their life or something that they did. So that is your homework over the next few weeks, to start thinking about that. We are very, very close to having all of our pictures done. So if your sponsor or your candidate wasn't here, we will definitely want to catch you next time so we can get that board completed. I think that should be everything at the moment. So I'm going to pass it back over to Ross, and he'll wrap us up a little bit and a prayer. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again, Ross.
Okay, so one last thing I guess I'll say before we wrap up here. I've written up here this thing I said kind of at the beginning. This saying is hard. Who can accept it? From the Gospel of John, it's the bread of life discourses. That's when Jesus is saying, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And it is kind of the bedrock of one of the most important things, the most important thing in the Catholic faith. And it kind of goes with what we said tonight. Maybe some of these things are hard for you to accept. Maybe some of the things that I said, maybe some of the things in the video, or maybe some of the things we wrote down, or even some of the things there right out of Scripture are hard for you to accept. But just like we said in the beginning, what is God revealing to you through these texts? What does He want you to know about Himself? And I've written down this right here. Maybe this would be good for you to read and meditate on this week. Genesis chapter 32, verses 23 through 34. This is Jacob wrestling with the angel across the river. Right? This is when he literally gets into a wrestling match with God, with an angel. Angels are not God, but His messenger, right? And so he's getting into a wrestling match with this, and you are to also kind of wrestle with your faith. You are also kind of wrestle with these things that are hard. He comes out on top, and then he's given a new name. We talked about Abram getting a new name, Sarai getting a new name, right? He's renamed Israel, right? And so that is a pretty important moment in salvation history. So maybe just something for you to pray, meditate on, and reflect. So let's go ahead and end with our prayer. Do you have the prayer back here? Okay, awesome. Would someone else like to read that? Let's read it all together. That'd be great. Okay. I apologize. I forgot to say a prayer at the beginning, so that's my bad. We'll get that better next time. So.